shamanism, spiritualism, energy work, rainbows and crystals, totems, and animal spirits. In our modern world, these things have existed in the realm of either exotic or non-white cultures, or they have been snugly in the possession of lefty wingnuts. In the sphere of Western paganism, there has been a great deal of discussion about reconnecting to holistic living, which is often connected to a "we are all one" ideology. The irony is that Europeans did in fact hold an animistic understanding of the world at one point in time. We too believed in an interconnectedness of life and fluidity between the spirit and mundane realms. In fact, the mortal world was not actually mundane at all. It was teeming with spiritual life force to the degree that you might say that Midgard, the land of mortals in the Teutonic worldview, was even seen as enchanted. It is fair to say that Europeans viewed the earth and life itself in a way not dissimilar to various indigenous spiritual traditions in the world. Indeed, animistic polytheism rooted in ancestor veneration was virtually a universal faith for humanity. However, it was not universalist. Spirituality was a unique expression tailored to each ethnic group. So while many themes can be found throughout the world in various ethnic faiths, each ethnic faith also varies with particulars and peculiarities that are specific to the people practicing it. In recent years, the revival of animism and belief in the metaphysical that sees human beings as interconnected with each other and our environment has tended to go hand in hand with the liberal doctrine that all human beings are one. But this is anachronistic. While the various peoples of the past, that is, prior to Abrahamic universalism, did hold many of the same or similar spiritual beliefs, they were cognizant of the reality of race and other ethnic differences. In other words, two different tribal groups may well have seen the landscape teeming with spirits, viewed themselves as interacting with both the spiritual and the material, and very likely believed in notions such as a cosmic web that connects all things. However, this in no way influenced people not to draw boundaries, borders, and engage in self-defense against neighboring rivals. In fact, it was universalist Christianity, not paganism, that was often used to make people forget their differences and join together in one ideological club. There was a clear understanding that the one God ideology was correlated with one people under one king. This is why Christianity was adopted by pagan kings looking to consolidate their power and expand their territory. Monotheism was useful to the feudal notion of monarchy. Monotheism was a tool to create monoculture, which helped to erase the differences between conquered tribes as they were merged into larger kingdoms. Therefore, the notion that an animistic worldview is equated with modern liberal one-world nonsense is anachronistic to historical pagan practice. An article by an author using the pen name Spangler on the Christian web journal called First Things sheds some light on this. The article, entitled Christian Muslim Jew, highlights the writings of a Jewish rabbi called Franz Rosenzweig. While Rosenzweig died in 1929, the author says that his philosophy was especially popular in the post-World War II era. Spangler describes World War II as a war between Abrahamism and neo-paganism, saying that, quote, after neo-paganism nearly conquered Europe, Rabbi Rosenzweig's contention that Christianity requires the presence of the Jews found great resonance, unquote. He continues, quoting again, pagans, Rosenzweig explained, have only the fragile and ultimately futile effort to preserve their physical continuity through blood and soil. Their hope for immortality takes the form of a perpetual fight for physical existence, which one day they must lose. Rosenzweig's sociology of religion thus offers unique insights into the origin and nature of civilizational conflict when he argues that a pagan people, ever sentient of the fragility of their existence, are always prepared to fight to the death, unquote. Much has been said over the years about paganism continuing to live on in the hearts and minds of ethnic Europeans. Rosenzweig's view that the presence of Jews in the West is a sort of paternalistic role, which stops Europeans from reverting to paganism, with Gnostic Christianity being a form of Christianity that merges indigenous spiritual worldview with Abrahamic scripture. Spangler says that Rosenzweig, quote, began a new kind of dialogue between Judaism and Christianity when he argued that the two faiths complement one another, Christianity to propagate revelation to the world, and Judaism to convert the inner pagan inside each Christian, unquote. He later continues, quoting again, Rosenzweig's most influential claim holds that the Jew converts the inner pagan inside the Christian, such that the living presence of the Jewish peoples creates a counterweight to the Gnostic impulses in Christianity, unquote. Rosenzweig's worldview clearly saw Judaism and Christianity working together in unity against a blood and soil worldview. Well, paganism is essentially ancestor worship and nature veneration, literally blood and soil. According to Rosenzweig, without the guiding hand of Judaism, Europeans would fall back into this belief system. Spangler explains, quote, Rosenzweig argues that pagan society cannot foster authentic human individuality, but dissolves the individual into an extension of a race or state, unquote. Well, this explains quite well how closely paganism is tied to ethnicity, whereas Christianity, guided by Judaism, is supposed to function as a universalizing force transcending racial boundaries. He continues on, quote, in pagan society where God remains unrevealed, the individual exists only as an organ of the collective of race or state. The pagan's sense of immortality therefore depends solely on the perpetuation of his race, and his most sacred act is to sacrifice himself in war to postpone the inevitable day when his race will go down in defeat, unquote. Well, I would say that this Jewish rabbi's views on paganism are accurate, and his discussion illuminates precisely why Christianity was used as the ideological tool to subdue disparate tribes into submission under an expanding empire with globalist aims. Indeed, if you begin to dig through old dictionaries for the definition of the word ethnic, what one finds is that before 1945 it had been used interchangeably with the words heathen and pagan. The word ethnos itself has origins in ancient Greek, wherein it was used to describe a collective group of creatures that are alike to one another. In the earliest usage, ethnos could be used interchangeably with words like hive, pack, flock, etc. However, it was also used to describe groups of people who were alike, such as a tribe or a race. The New Testament verse Romans 10:2 supports Rabbi Rosenzweig's point of view. Quote, "For there is no difference between the Jew and the Greek, for the same Lord over all is rich unto all that call upon him." Unquote. Add to this that the word used by Saul turned Paul of Tarsus in the original Greek New Testament, which has been translated into English as pagan, was originally ethnikos. It is quite clear that Rosenzweig was correct. Christianity had a directive to remove barriers between ethnicity, while paganism was synonymous with ethnic identity. Therefore, hippy-dippy pagans pushing no borders are practicing the wrong religion. But how did this confused form of paganism begin? In light of what Spangler said about Rosenzweig's views of paganism and Spangler's own assertion that World War II was, quote, neo-paganism nearly conquering Europe, unquote, it is interesting to look at the birth of Wicca. Modern liberal pagans owe a debt of gratitude to Gerald Gardner, the founder of Wicca. It is important to note that pagan revivalist movements have popped up in virtually every century in Western history. The notion that modern pagan practice originated with the advent of Wicca is false. Further, Wicca is not a reconstructed pagan path at all, but rather a contrived religion cobbled together with bits and pieces from Germanic and Celtic belief mixed together with ceremonial magic. According to his Wikipedia biography, Gardner was a Freemason. It is curious that Gardner appeared on the scene the same year that World War II came to a close. Gardner's Wikipedia article explains, quote, "Moving to London in 1945, he became intent on propagating this religion, attracting media attention," unquote. Witchcraft had been outlawed in Britain for centuries, but the Witchcraft Act was repealed under Winston Churchill's watch only a few short years later in 1951. Winston Churchill was also a Freemason. Prior to World War II, ethnicity and paganism went hand in hand and had done for millennia. In 1945, Gerald Gardner made his way to London, quote, intent on propagating his religion, unquote, which was a cobbled-together mishmash that confuses Teutonic and Celtic cultures, but ultimately leads practitioners away from both. While there is no smoking gun to prove a conspiracy, these are interesting coincidences to take note of. We can see that Europeans once had an animistic worldview, just like other indigenous spiritual systems, that this was distinctly ethnic-based, but this did not equate the modern liberal "we are all one" nonsense, at least not until 1945. So what did we believe, and why does it behoove us to look at our own ethnic folkways in the modern world? Well, a good place to start is with the original meaning of the word God. The early Judeo-Christian missionaries used cultural appropriation quite liberally when packaging their ideology to Europeans. Many words from our own indigenous lexicon were used to sell Christianity. The word God is only one of many words taken and twisted from its original meaning. It is a Teutonic origin word with close cognates found all across the Germanic landscape. Etymonline says, from Proto-Germanic Guthon, source also of Old Saxon, Old Phrygian, Dutch God, Old High German Gott, German Gott, Old Norse Guth, Gothic Guth, perhaps from the Proto-Indo-European Gut, that which is invoked, to call, invoke. The notion could be divine entity summoned to a sacrifice, but some trace it to the Proto-Indo-European gutu, poured, from the root gu, to pour a libation, and so on. May have referred in the first instance to the spirit immanent in a burial mound. Originally a neuter noun in Germanic, the gender is shifted to masculine after the coming of Christianity. Old English God probably was closer in sense to Latin numen. So if the Teutonic word God was closer to the Latin word numen, what is the meaning of numen? Per Merriam-Webster dictionary, numen, a spiritual force or influence often identified with a natural object, phenomenon, or place. Therefore, in the Germanic context, God had an animistic meaning. We believed that our landscape and the creatures within it were imbued with spiritual forces that we called gods. The act of honoring these gods involved pouring libations or offerings in propitiation. This act also appealed to these spirits to invoke their presence. We offered sacrifice so that the gods might intercede here on Midgard. It is documented that sacred springs were venerated across European language boundaries. Dr. Brian Bates discusses the enchanted landscape of Northern Europeans in his book, The Real Middle-earth, Magic and Mystery in the Dark Ages. He draws distinction between the more rationalist worldview of the Romans compared to that of the Celts and Teutons. However, he does have to concede some spiritual practices were held in common. He says, quote, "The Romans are counterpointed elsewhere in this book as lacking some of the imaginative sensitivities of a Middle-earth culture. However, they also honored wells. One well dating back to prehistoric times was discovered in 1876. Excavations showed that it had originally been built by the Celts and had subsequently been taken over by the occupying Romans. Displacing the indigenous Celts, or at least setting up military overlordship, they built a fort at the well, right at the northern border of England, called Brocolita, now named Carabro. Artifacts recovered at the well show that it was dedicated to Coventina, almost certainly a local Celtic goddess who was adopted by the Romans," unquote. But we know that the sacred wells and springs were honored in Britain even prior to the arrival of the Celts. A British documentary series called Walking Through History, hosted by Tony Robinson, features an episode called The Path to Stonehenge, which gives a lovely discussion with several leading anthropologists and historians about recent, as of 2013, theories regarding the purpose of Neolithic sites in Britain. Ancestor veneration features prominently in Neolithic European culture, but water veneration also appears frequently. Robinson speaks with experts who explain the role of ancestors as guardians of the living, but also that water is venerated for its life-giving force. The official website for Stonehenge echoes this interpretation. Discussing the wider complex connecting Stonehenge to Avebury and Silbury Hill, the website says, quote, "In late winter, early spring, the winter-born, or dry in winter, River Kennet resurfaces and floods the low-lying land. The ditch surrounding Silbury Hill is filled and again forms the shape of the squatting mother goddess. Such a clever design, using the seasonal flow of the river to venerate the provider and where, from the summit, she would be visible. The annual fresh flow of life-giving water from the Swallowhead Spring to swell the River Kennet would have held great significance to the population living in and around Avebury. Swallowhead Spring would have been seen as part of the goddess's living body. We see spring, the herald of new life, the first age of man, and the first season of Mother Earth. Contrast with the absence of water flowing from the earth, which could signify drought, crop failure, and to those reliant on those waters, death, if the provider withheld the bounty. It is interesting that Dr. Bates discusses the Roman adoption of Celtic sacred springs because Roman Christianity used the same tactic. Places that were seen as holy since time immemorial continued to be venerated by the populace even after nominal conversion. The historical record has preserved numerous edicts and letters of instruction from the Catholic hierarchy, sometimes urging the destruction of indigenous European holy sites, the outlawing of veneration of natural objects, or sometimes instructions to appropriate these sites for Christian use. Della Hooke, in her well-researched book called Trees in Anglo-Saxon England, gives a lengthy discussion citing ample historical documentation of the Christian attack on nature veneration. She says Frankish Christian kings were anxious to wipe out the worship of springs, trees, and sacred groves, and set fines in the later 8th century for those who thus made vows at such places or squandered praises on pagan gods, and ordered that such trees, stones, and springs where foolish lights or other observances were used or carried out should be removed or destroyed. The Council of Nantes in 895 specifically ordered the destruction of trees consecrated to demons or local gods." Unquote. Interestingly, the Frankish attacks on indigenous European culture are further evidence that Rabbi Rosenzweig is accurate in his assertion regarding the relationship between Judaism and Christianity in their unity against the ethnikos, or pagans. A Jewish scholar called Arthur Zuckerman put intensive research into his book, A Jewish Princeton in Feudal France, 768 to 900 AD, published by Columbia University Press in 1972. Apparently, there was a Jewish principality in southern France that has been completely forgotten today. This community played a role in the story of Europe versus the Moors in Spain, in the early medieval trade routes, the establishment of networks of credit and the banking system, and also in the Christianization of Northern Europeans. According to Zuckerman's research, the Franks granted land to the Jews of Septimania on the condition that they locate a descendant of Israel's King David to crown as their own king. A scholar from the line of David was found in Babylonia and made king of Septimania. Author Lee Levin sums up the story in his article for the Jewish magazine called The Jewish Kingdom of Septimania, wherein he explains that the Carolingian dynasty lacked a royal bloodline, and so their family married in with this new King Mahir. Levin says Mahir would give oaths of allegiance to the king of the Franks. King Charles requested that Mahir marry his aunt Alda. A request from the king of the Franks was a command. All now became clear. This was why Pepin had required that the king of Septimania be a direct descendant of King David. The problem for Pepin and for his son King Charles was that Pepin had usurped the throne of the Franks from the Merovingians. Thus there was no royal blood in their veins. This they desperately needed in order to establish the legitimacy of their dynasty. By this marriage of Alda to Machir, who was a direct lineal descendant of King David, they would not only have royal blood in the veins of their descendants, but the most royal blood possible, the blood of David himself. But how could such a marriage take place? Alda was a Catholic, and no Catholic priest would marry her to a Jew unless the Jew converted, which of course Machir absolutely could not do. On the other hand, no rabbi would marry Machir to a Gentile unless she converted. An unsolvable dilemma? Apparently not, for marry they did, and had a legitimate son through whom Jewish blood was now intermingled with that of the Carolingian kings of France. Unquote. It is further explained in Zuckerman's scholarly work that, quote, at the time Pepin admitted Machir to the high Frank aristocracy, he may well have dubbed him with a distinguished dynastic name. Theodoric suggests itself because its frequent reappearance in later generations of the Machiri, unquote. Zuckerman asserts that, quoting again, prevailing view that the Franks allied with the Goths defies the evidence. Pepin was allied with the Caliph of Baghdad, and they worked together for a Franco-Abbasid domination over Spain, unquote. And then he continues, after the fall of Narbonne and the amicable outcome of the negotiations with Baghdad in 765 to 768, Pepin and his sons Carloman and Charles redeemed their pledge to the Jews and settled a scholar prince in Narbonne by the name of Machir. They dubbed him Theodoric, gave him a Carolingian Frankish princess as a wife, and endowed him with noble status in addition to vast allodial estates. That Pepin's son Charlemagne granted economic privileges to Jews in his realm is well supported in the historical record. The same is noted of Charlemagne's son, Louis the Pious. Charlemagne would go on to become famous for the horrific slaughter at Verdun, where he killed 4,500 unarmed Saxon chieftains in cold blood. Louis the Pious is thus named for his penchant for collecting all known writings on indigenous European culture and setting them alight. These tactics would be echoed by converted Christian kings for centuries as they joined Christendom, a forerunner to the modern EU, which granted economic privileges and trade incentives. But dedication to and practice of our indigenous folkways lingered on among the populace despite the efforts of their elite overlords. Eventually, the Protestant Reformation would rightly notice that under Catholicism, Europeans remained essentially pagan. And so again, secular and religious authorities rounded up individuals suspected of engaging in their own indigenous practices and set living people on fire for this sin. That famous Protestant work ethic coincided with the rise of mercantile economy and the capitalist machine that has dominated the West in more recent generations. While atheism is often blamed for the loss of the sacred, industrialization occurred in Western nations that were still overwhelmingly Christian. Industrialization arguably raped and abused the natural landscape, both by unethical harvesting of resources and the pollution that ensued. Today we stand upon a precipice and ask ourselves, which way, Western man? Many are observant enough to see that those who present history are rewriting it in front of our very eyes. We can see media misrepresenting facts, such as the historical ethnic demographics in Europe, that our academic and educational institutions are literally indoctrinating students from their tender years through university is news to no one. Yet, there is a chasm of disconnect when it comes to looking critically at the recording and telling of other areas of history and the roles that elite-imposed ideological precursors to modern liberalism have played in driving us to the scenario in which we find ourselves today. The dissident right looks at the media and scoffs at the lying press, while they simultaneously allow themselves to be manipulated by it. An analytic jaunt through the history of historical paganism, the figures responsible for the spreading of Christianity at sword point, and their connections and activities, coupled with a closer look at 20th century history, turns the standing understanding on its head. Shamanism, spiritualism, energy work, rainbows and crystals, totems and animal spirits belong to lefty wingnuts only so long as we eschew our own ethnic, spiritual inheritance. This is a question of dire significance. For when the fight for ethnic viability is over, immediate questions arise on the horizon. Will we defeat the globalists only to allow their goals to continue under the guise of universalism? But more pressing will become the need to wrestle environmentalism away from the left. What good will it be to save our race if we have destroyed our own planet? While it may not be realistic to expect a mass return to animism as a religion in the immediate, it can be said that had we never been forced to abandon the gods of our landscape, we would have been better stewards of this earth. Western man must ask himself squarely if he believes in blood and soil. If the answer is yes, then hope springs eternal. This has been a reading of The Death and Resurrection of European Paganism, which you can read for free online on the Arctos web journal at arctos.com. It's also available in the Folkright Journal, issue 1, available on amazon.com, and read more of my work on carolynemerick.com.